Hello, friends. Before listening to the story of an old racist policeman attacking Keanu Reeves in court, turning pale when he found out his real identity, please help the Heroic Acts Story 3 channel to grow by liking, positive comments, and subscribing. Hopefully those who support Chanel will become the best human beings. Let's continue with the story. Racist old cop attacks Keanu Reeves in court, turns pale when he finds out his real identity. The courtroom was filled with tension. Officer Harold McGinty, a retired cop with over 40 years on the force, sat at the defendant's table, arms crossed, scowling. His grizzled face, lined with arrogance, barely concealed his annoyance at having to be there. Across from him sat a man in a black suit, long dark hair tied back, his expression calm but unreadable. He had yet to speak, but the entire courtroom was drawn to his presence. The judge cleared her throat. "We will now hear from the plaintiff. Mr. Reeves, please step forward." McGinty scoffed, rolling his eyes. This ought to be good. Keanu stood up, adjusting his suit before walking toward the stand. His movements were smooth, effortless, like a man who had nothing to prove. But the moment he turned to face McGinty, a strange flicker of recognition crossed the old cop's face. He squinted, tilting his head slightly. The prosecutor began. "Officer McGinty, do you deny attacking Mr. Reeves outside the courthouse last week?" McGinty snorted. "I don't even know this guy." Keanu finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "That's not true," McGinty chuckled. "Oh yeah? Then why don't you tell everyone what really happened?" Keanu folded his hands. "I was walking outside the courthouse when you approached me. You told me to get lost and called me a—" He paused for a moment before continuing. "Street rat. I told you I was there for a meeting, and you got aggressive. You grabbed my arm, shoved me against a car, and told me people like me didn't belong in places like this." Murmurs filled the courtroom. McGinty smirked. "Sounds like something I'd say to a troublemaker." The prosecutor lifted a remote and pressed play on the courtroom screen. Security footage appeared, grainy but clear enough. It showed McGinty shoving Keanu with unnecessary force, jabbing a finger in his face, his mouth moving aggressively. The audio wasn't available, but the intent was crystal clear. McGinty's smirk faded. The prosecutor turned to him. "Still don't remember?" McGinty's eyes flicked back to Keanu, and the realization hit him like a brick wall. His face went pale. His hands twitched slightly on the table. Keanu met his gaze with an unreadable expression. "Do you recognize me now?" McGinty swallowed hard. You're... Keanu nodded. "Keanu Reeves." The courtroom erupted. Reporters whispered furiously. The judge banged her gavel for silence. McGinty's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The prosecutor leaned in. "So let me get this straight. You saw one of the most famous actors in the world, a well-known philanthropist, and assumed he was a criminal, that he didn't belong in a courthouse." McGinty shrank in his seat. His career had been built on profiling, intimidation, and unchecked authority. But now, sitting in front of the entire world, he was exposed for what he truly was. The judge sighed. "Officer McGinty, based on the evidence, I find you guilty of assault and racial profiling. Sentencing will follow." Keanu stood up and buttoned his jacket. He gave McGinty one last look before walking out of the courtroom. Cameras flashed, reporters yelled his name, but he ignored them. Because this wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had been silenced. And today, for once, the silence had been broken. As Keanu stepped out of the courthouse, the press swarmed like a tidal wave. Reporters shoved microphones toward him, flashing cameras captured every angle, and a mix of supporters and protesters filled the air with their voices. "Mr. Reeves, do you have a statement? Are you planning to take legal action against Officer McGinty? Do you think this case will set a precedent for police reform?" Keanu paused at the top of the courthouse steps, looking out over the crowd. He took a deep breath before speaking, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't about me. It's about accountability. No one should be judged based on how they look or where they are. No one should be treated like they don't belong. And no one, no matter their position, should be above the law." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Before anyone could ask another question, Keanu gave a small nod and walked to his car, disappearing into the city streets. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Officer McGinty remained frozen in his chair. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but he wasn't listening. His mind was spinning. How had he not recognized Keanu Reeves? How had he let his instincts, his years of ingrained bias, push him into this disaster? He had always gotten away with things like this before. He had roughed people up, thrown his weight around, and no one had ever questioned him. But this time, he had picked the wrong person, the wrong victim. Prison wasn't an immediate sentence, but McGinty knew it was coming. The public outrage was overwhelming. More of his past cases were being reopened, and the department had already distanced itself from him. A week later, he sat alone in his small apartment, the weight of disgrace crushing him. His phone buzzed, a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. A deep, calm voice spoke. "Officer McGinty." McGinty's breath caught in his throat. "Who is this?" "You know who I am." Silence. Keanu Reeves. McGinty gripped the phone. "Why are you calling me?" Another pause. Then Keanu's voice came through, steady and composed. "I don't hate you, McGinty. I don't wish you harm. But you have a choice. You can let this destroy you, or you can change." McGinty squeezed his eyes shut, the weight of everything pressing down on him. No one had ever spoken to him like that, not with anger, not with hatred, but with something worse. Disappointment. He swallowed, his throat dry. He wanted to lash out, to justify, to blame, but he had no excuses left. The line went dead. McGinty stared at his phone, heart pounding. He had spent his life believing he was untouchable, that people like him would always have the upper hand. But for the first time in his life, he realized maybe he had been wrong all along.